Welcome. This is not Bethany outside of Jerusalem. Too hard to find a background photo. So here we are back to this just bunch of rocks in a field somewhere in Jerusalem. Though I think this is probably farther north. We are in John 11, which means this is lecture 12. So as we want to start always, we're going to look at the outline of this passage and see what we need to deal with. The first 44 verses deal with Lazarus. Now it can be broken down into some small sections. In where Lazarus is, Jesus is beyond the Jordan. Jesus comes to where Lazarus is. Jesus goes to the tomb. But let's just start verse by verse and see what we have. So verse 1 and 2 is the setting, tells us what's going on. 3 is the message sent to Jesus. 4 through 6 tells us about Jesus delaying. Verses 7 and 8, the disciples return or respond to Jesus returning, and they're kind of concerned. 9 through 11, Jesus teaches them about what's going on. Verse 12 is the disciples again, and because they don't understand, misunderstanding is always common in the gospel. Verses 13 through 15, Jesus now clarifies his teaching of 9 through 11. And in verse 16, Thomas responds with a hearty, "Let's go. If we got to die, we got to die." One of those nice Thomas moments. Then in verses 17 through 19, Jesus goes to Bethany. Verses 20 through 22, he interacts with Martha. 23 through 27 is the important resurrection dialogue. 28 through 31, Mary now comes to Jesus, or a discussion about Mary. In verse 32, Mary goes to Jesus. In 33 through 35, Jesus responds. Verse 36 through 37, the Jews are responding. And 38 through 44 is the tomb scene. So a lot of back and forth between Jesus and other people. Always one, a group, the crowd, or an individual, but a lot of back and forth. We don't have the lengthy dialogue that we had in John 7 or 8, or even the confusing dialogue of 10. So now we have the responses. 45, the onlookers and what they do. 46, some of them go report this to the Pharisees. 47 through 50, the response by the leaders. And then the narrator comes and interludes in verses 51 through 52. Again, in 53, response by the leaders. In verse 54, we go back to Jesus who moves, and then the Passover preparation in 55 through 57. So very lengthy, a lot going on. We could get caught up in the weeds, but oh well. Let's just go. What are some themes that we're dealing with in John 11 that we should be attentive to? Well, one of the themes is the theme of sickness. This is not the first time that we've seen it. Sickness in the ancient world uses the Greek word weakness. And so they don't really have one for being ill. They're just weak. They're not able to perform as they ought to be performing. But in chapter 4, verse 46, we have a young man who is sick, which makes you then understand that, hey, Jesus spoke a word from afar in chapter 4. Why doesn't he just do that in chapter 11? Well, because healing doesn't just happen as a reoccurring thing. There was another purpose for Lazarus' situation. We see that in the opening of Jesus' discussion with his disciples. Chapter 5, 3 through 7, we have another man who's been weak now for 38 years. Jesus speaks to him and a word, and he gets up and walks. In 6:2, we see that people are following him because he's healed the sick. And then at the opening of this particular chapter, there was a certain man who was sick, right? And in verse 3, Lord, he whom you love is sick. So sickness, the ability of Jesus to heal the sick is never in doubt. It's just a question of when is that going to happen. We then have a use of this term love in verse 3, the one whom you love. And there it is a Greek word. Could be agape, it could be phileo. A lot of questions in the Gospel of John about whether or not there is intentional differences between the use of these words, or if it is simply a literary practice to swap the words so that you're not saying the same verb over and 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 over again. Agape oftentimes associated with God's love, phileo with brotherly love. And so after a considerable amount of time studying the Gospel of John, I think it's a literary technique to swap these words. They're closely related, very different than the other Greek words for love. One of those challenges that we have in English is our limited vocabulary. So anyway, in chapter 5, verse 20 and 11:3, the Greek word is phileo, the one whom you have brotherly kindness for. What is 5:20? That's a great question. What goes on there? It's been the healing, right? So why does he use phileo? Okay. Well, it says the Father loves the Son and shows him all things that he is doing. Well, now that's very interesting, that the Father's love would be phileo. Maybe it's just literary. If God's love is always agape, then it would not be agape there. It is phileo. And in verse 36 of John 11, right, when we go back to that, right, verse 36, the Jews say, see how he loved him. That's also phileo. But we have agapao is the verb form of love. And of course, John 3:16, God loved the world. Chapter 8, verse 42, chapter 10:17, and then in 11:5. So right after the sisters say the one whom you love is sick, it says Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus, using agapao. So I really do think that this is just a literary technique so that the same verb is not constantly showing up in the dialogue. It's not unusual for them to use synonyms. It's unusual for us to use synonyms just to avoid repeating the same word again and again. All right, a couple other themes, death and sleep, that in the ancient world, Paul uses this in his particular language, that those who are asleep, meaning dying or dead. It's used here in John as well, chapter 5:24, chapter 8, and in chapter 11. We have the glory of God being used, right? Jesus said the sickness is not to end in death, but is for the glory of God, so that the Son of Man may be glorified by it. And that's going to be very important in chapter 12, which we're going to get to next time as we deal with chapter 12 and 13 at the same time. But the glory of God has been very important. We see that, right? Not only in the prologue, but also in chapter 5, verse 44. How can you believe when you receive glory from one another and do not seek the glory that is from the one and only God? So he's talking about different types of glory, and some seek human glory, others seek a different kind. And then in chapter 9, after the healing of the man born blind in verse 24, they, the Pharisees, tell him, give glory to God. We know this man is a sinner. He goes, I don't know. I mean, really? He healed me. He healed a blind man. It's never happened before. I don't know what to do. And then in verse 40 of chapter 11, as Jesus is praying, he prays for one thing in particular, right? And what does he pray for? Glory. He says to Martha, very interestingly, did I not say to you that if you believe, you will receive the glory of God? And he prays, I knew that you hear me, and the people do. I say this so they may believe that you sent me. So the glory of God is seen in this answering of God to raise Lazarus. But the interesting thing is, you may have noticed, this wasn't recorded in the dialogue with Martha earlier in the chapter. It's an added feature. One of the things we assume is that everything's recorded, but it's not. Sometimes pieces are left out and brought in later in the story that fill in and backfill what was going on. Another key word, right? In verse 40, did not say to you that if you believe, you'll see the glory of God. Well, the word believe shows up 98 times in the Gospels. So we can't really look at all those. And it's almost always a verb. In fact, it is always a verb, pistuo, to believe, to have faith, to trust. It's a very important theme, and it's picked up here in John chapter 11. And then we have the theme of the resurrection. In his discussion with Martha, verses 24 and 25, she believes that her brother will rise again in the resurrection on the last day. And there was a common thought, not every Jew thought it, but among many of the Jews, that there would be a resurrection that would happen at the time when God's people, or when God's kingdom was brought about, and that people would be raised and become part of this kingdom. We know the Pharisees believed in resurrection, the Sadducees did not, so we know that there's conflict over that. But Jesus has said, I am the resurrection and the life. So we have this idea of resurrection, but it too, surprisingly, is talked about in John 5. So John 5 is related to John 9. It's also related to somewhat to John 11 in the language. So in verse 29, Jesus says, an hour is coming, which all who are in the tombs will hear his voice and will come forth. Those who did the good deeds to a resurrection of life, and those who committed the evil deeds to a resurrection of judgment. So this theme of resurrection is brought about so that we understand those things. So we're going to go ahead and pause right now so that this lecture doesn't become too lengthy, and we'll pick up with another theme, the one coming into the world. Very, very important in the Gospel of John.